One waterways 21 miles wide and its narrowest point, and though it flows roughly one-fifth of the world's most entire oil supply, now the United States have deployed 15,000 troops to that waterways, not to detect a conflict, but in the middle of one. They have given the operation a name, Project Freedom. The mission is to force that strait open, secure international shipping lanes, and escort stranded commercial vessels through waterways that the world can no longer take it for granted. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz in the coming weeks will not just determine the outcomes of war, it will determine the prices of fuel, the stability of a global supply chain, and the economic fate of billions of people who have never heard of the MV to Oscar or Project Freedom. On Monday, May 4th, 2026, U.S. Central Command officially announced the launch of a large-scale military operation in the Strait of Hormuz. The operation, named Project Freedom, involves 15,000 American troops and have been ordered directly by President Donald Trump. The stated objective are specific, secure international shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz and evacuate commercial vessels that have become stranded in the strategic waterways as a result of the ongoing conflicts between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Let those numbers sit for a moment. 15,000 troops, not a patrol, not a show of force, a full-scale military operation in one of the most geopolitically sensitive waterways on the planet, at a moment when Iran has already signaled that the strait will no longer return to its pre-war condition. This is not a defensive posture. A Project Freedom is an assertion, a declaration that the United States intend to control the flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz by force if necessary, and that no act, including Iran, will be permitted to use the strait as a pressure point against global commands. To understand the stake of the Project Freedom, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is and what its disruptions mean to the rest of the world. The strait is the narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. On one side sits Iran, on the other side sits Oman, and its narrowest point is roughly 21 miles wide, and through that corridor moves somewhere between 15 and 20% of global oil supply daily, along with significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, all of these oil export routes pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no alternative pipeline network that can fully replace that volume. In the strait closes, and if shipping insurance become too expensive for tankers to transit, the economic consequences are immediate and global. Oil prices spike, the energy cost rises, supply chains that depends on petrochemicals are disrupted. Countries that import oil which includes most of Africa, much of Asia, and a significant portion of Europe, feels the pressure almost immediately. Iran has understood this leverage for decades. The threat to close the Strait of Hormuz has been a cornerstone of Iranian deterrence strategy for years. What is new is that the United States is now responding to that threat not with warning but 15,000 troops and a named military operation. Before Project Freedom was even announced, Iran lawmakers had already drawn a line in the sand. Iranian parliamentary figures stated clearly that the Strait of Hormuz will not return to its pre-war state. That statement was not a threat of imminent closure. It was something arguably more significant. It was a declaration that whatever equilibrium existed before this conflict began no longer applies. The rules have changed. The strait in Iran's framing is now a contested space, not a neutral commercial corridor. Iran also has a 14th-point proposal on the table aimed at ending the war. The details of that proposal and whether the Trump administration will engage with remains unclear. But the existence of a formal proposal alongside a military escalation tells you something important. Iran is pursuing both tracks simultaneously, fighting and negotiating at the same time, as most parties in serious conflicts eventually do. The question is whether Project Freedom hardens Iran's position or creates enough pressure to move it. History suggests that military operations of this kind rarely produce clean outcomes. They create leverage, yes, but they also create incidents, seized ship, confrontation at sea, casualties that can escalate in direction no one planned. Project Freedom is an American military operation, but its consequences are not American alone. China receives a significant portion of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing has already been accused by Washington of shipping dual-use goods to Iran, materials that could support Iranian military capacity. The accusation adds a layer to a greater power competition to what is already a complex regional war. If China is seen as actively supporting Iran's capacity to resist the blockade, the conflict stops being a US-Israel-Iran triangle and becomes something far more dangerous. Europe is watching the energy implication closely. The continent has been working to reduce the dependence on Russian energy since 2022. Much of the alternative supply runs through the Middle Eastern routes that the Strait of Hormuz facilitates. A prolonged Hormuz disruption would force European government into a difficult choice about energy. Sourcing at a moment when they are already managing significant economic pressure. For African nations, the impact would be felt at the fuel pump and in the goods or the cost of goods almost immediately. Countries that depend on oil imports, and most do, would see inflation pressure that their government are not positioned to absorb easily. Project Freedom is being fought in waters thousands of miles from Nairobi, Lagos, or Agra, but its outcome will arrive there